It's been 30 years since Shopping Centre News published its first big guns. That's the issue. 30 years ago. And I bought this publication. And I got an art director to change its image. And she gave me that logo. And she gave me the shape of the magazine and its identity. And we started the big guns. And we just got this article. And we wrote about it. And got all the major players to give us the big centres. And we called it Australia's largest centre. And the art director of Shopping Centre News, a girl called Lorraine Hall, she had to design the cover. She designed the whole magazine. So she designed the cover. And she came in one day with that. And we said, what's this? What's these cannons? And she said, I gave it a name. She said, I called it Big Guns because they're big shopping centres. So I called it Big Guns. And that's how it started. And she's in the room today. Lorraine, stand up. Where are you? You're over there somewhere. There she is. So the name Big Guns comes from Lorraine. Thanks, Lorraine. That was 30 years ago. And I bought the publication a few years before that. 30 years seems a long time. And in those days, long-term property investment was about 20 to 25 years. I remember doing my first regional shopping centre, and it was MacArthur Square in Campbelltown. And it was owned, one of the major investors was ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries of UK. And their chairman and their board used to come out once a year to the PCG. And it was a nice jaunt for them. You know, they could come around the world and stop off at Hawaii and everywhere. And I remember we were talking in the PCG and somebody mentioned 20 years. And the chairman of ICI said, oh, yes, we will still be owning this in 20 years because we're in it for the long term. And if you think about that, that was long term in those days. And today, that's not long term at all. If you think of a 17-year-old who starts work today and therefore puts a percentage of his money in superannuation, the superannuation fund has got to keep pace with that money for how long? Well, in 50 years' time, he's going to be 67, or she's going to be 67. In 50 years' time, life expectancy is probably going to be around 100. So they'll probably retire early to mid-70s. So they've got to maintain that investment. They've got to keep pace with inflation, make a bit for themselves, make a bit for their investors, the superannuants, and they've got to do it for the next 60-odd years. I was very fortunate in my early career. One of my mentors was Dick Dusseldorp, who founded Lend-Lease. And he said to me once, very early on in my career, he said, Michael, if you think of the future, all the money is going to be in sovereign wealth funds, in pension funds, in superannuation funds. And if you can think of an investment that will keep pace with inflation or beat it by 1% per annum for the next 35 years, you could probably be one of the richest men in the world. And that's quite true. it's one of the most difficult things to achieve, is to keep pace with inflation. Our industry, the shopping centre industry in Australia, has beat inflation by more than 2 points per annum for the last 60 years. And that is quite staggering. If you look at all the OECD countries, and you add to that America and some other non-OECD countries, if you look at property investment as a sector, not as a specific building, but as a whole sector, the most successful property sector in the world has been the Australian regional shopping centre. And it's now at a point where it's moving to the next 60 years. And because of great laws in this country, because of great lobbying to authorities, to government, to councils, we've got a situation where our major shopping centres are secure, they're in proper regions. You cannot replicate these things. And you look at some of the analysts who talk about retail's finished. I mean, it's quite pathetic when you look at it. We're not talking about retail with our shopping centres. The latest edition, which you have on your table, looks at Centre Group, and they don't call them shopping centres anymore. They call them living centres. And if you read that magazine, they're about to give that away too. And they're going to become living destinations. And that's what our shopping centres are. And I think as the world moves towards online and e-commerce and social media and people activating relationships on a phone, on a laptop, there's one thing that you will never, ever take away from our species, mankind, and that is the great need for social interaction. And our shopping centres in Australia are going to become those places for social interaction. And whatever people do, I wrote about a year ago in one of my From the Publisher things, if everybody decided to spend their money on dancing, and that was what they were going to do in 30 years' time, they're going to do nothing else but go dancing. The spaces that we now have as department stores would become large places for Glenn Miller and 40-piece orchestras and large dances. And all the specialty shops would become places where you went to learn the rumba or the cha-cha-cha. It's just what people do. And we manage community focal points. The change from that, and the change from retail, pure retail, into what people do and what people will do in the future, that change is with us now. And COVID, as it has done a lot of things, has accelerated that. And it fascinates me to look at where these centres are going in the future, what they're going to be like. And we've got a great panel here this afternoon. And the panel, would you like to come up and join me, please? We've got a great panel here of people who are toying with these problems. They're not problems, they're challenges. And we've talked about it over the past couple of weeks, what we're going to talk about, what the issues are. And the issues are, where are our centres going? Not in the very long term, because that's a bit academic. Where are they going to go in the next 5 years? And what are our shopping centres going to be like in 5 years' time from now? Because they're going to be very, very different. So, without any more ado, let's talk. I've made a couple of notes. So forgive me while I just get them together. Peter.
Start with me. Thanks, Michael.
Leanne has already introduced the panel, but I should do it again because it's a great panel. And we've got next to me Michael O'Brien. Michael O'Brien is Managing Director of QIC, Global Real Estate. And they've got a shopping centre portfolio in Australia that's quite staggering. Includes Castle Hill, amongst other things. And we'll talk about that as we go. Next to Michael is Kelly Miller. And it's a really interesting company, Mirvac, when it comes to shopping centres, because they're way out there. Under the direction of Sue McDonald, who's here today, some years ago, they started to really branch out into different kinds of retail. And they bought stuff that other people didn't really want. Stuff like Birkenhead Point and other stuff like that. And really changed them. And Kelly now runs it. Next to Kelly, we got Peter Huddle, who's no stranger to any of us. He's got one of the most successful shopping centres in the world under his belt, Chadstone. And Vicinity has got a portfolio that's absolutely tops, and it needs no description. And next to Peter, we have Michelle Tierney, and that's very interesting too, because Michelle runs a whole host of centres that are quite small, their neighbourhood, and some of them are a bit bigger, but she hasn't got any big guns, but they're changing rapidly too. And I think we should involve the whole of this industry in this discussion. And bringing up the rear is Marco Ettorre. And Marco runs AMP's retail. And we all know AMP's retail. It's got some of the best centres in this country and some of the best centres in the world. So, Peter, I'm going to start off with CBDs. Now, we've got some big guns in CBDs. In fact, the highest big gun in turnover is in Sydney. And there are several big gun centres in CBDs. What's the changing face of CBD retail in the next 5 years?
Well, I'll probably start in the next 2 years. I think Kelly and myself have a similar issue at the moment. I mean, fundamentally, we've got to get vibrancy back to CBDs. We have some great assets in CBDs in Brisbane, to a lesser degree, less impacted. But Sydney and Melbourne has obviously had a major impact through the pandemic. The last weekend in Sydney alone, we got traffic up to about 80%. We're celebrating 80% of 2019, but that was a fantastic result. So, I mean, vibrancy for the CBDs. One, from a company point of view, most of our forward assistance, subject to no more, hopefully no more lockdowns, will be in really making sure the vibrancy of CBDs is still there. So for us, just look at QBB, they're great SME retailers. They're typically generational businesses. There's a lot of gifting, bespoking sort of offers within that centre, but it does rely on a vibrant commercial business. Our stat is it's probably 25% of the traffic's in a CBD is a commercial office worker, but it only is about 5% of the spend. But it's still important for that worker to be in there.
And when do you think that CBD is going to come back?
I mean, how long's a piece of string? But it's subject to the current conditions and subject to the international borders opening back up, because that's a huge component. We don't think we'll be really at 2019 levels until 2024. And a lot of it's related to that, what we're seeing, some really good growth in domestic tourism back into our CBD. That opening of international borders is important, particularly for the students and particularly for Melbourne, where there's universities in the middle of the CBD, for yourself as well. And then on top of that, it's more of an industry, it's a whole of economy problem. We've got to be in a position to get a better perception around public transport, to get people in and out of CBDs, Melbourne in particular at the moment. And then it's around industry working together around major events and around incentives, whether they're financial, to encourage people to come back into the CBD. Kelly, I'm not sure if you...
Don't worry,
Sort me out,
I'll sort him out. I'm used to sorting out all the blokes
Isn't
in
it?
property.
Isn't it?
Thank you.
Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? I like that. Marco, you got some CBD stuff. Anything to add to that, or is it said it all?
Yeah, most of our exposure obviously is retail that sits below sort of the commercial office tower. QQT, obviously, we're in leasing mode at the moment. I think similar to what Peter said, I think we need that vibrancy back. We need people returning to the office. I think that will help to drive that foot traffic, which is effective.
And when do you think it's going to happen?
I'm back, Marco.
I think different CBDs will move differently, and different pockets of the CBD will move differently.
That's evading the question. When do you think CBDs are going to be back?
Probably sort of, over the next 12 months, I think it'll improve. Probably back end of 23 is probably when we'll start to see normality return, where we'll start to see, this flexible working environment, I think, play out, and just exactly what does that mean for different businesses. And I think, therefore, you'll get that, what is the new normal potentially, and then we'll be able to sort of reset at that point. But you're probably looking at another 12 months for that to sort of play out.
Michael, anything to add?
Well, I think there has been a structural change in the way that people work, and we've all experienced that. So I think the working from home trend, depending on the role and the individual and their circumstances at home, I think that has permanently changed, and it's probably going to settle down over the next couple of years. So I think the prevalence of people, commuting 5 days a week into the city, which we all did for so long, I think that has actually changed quite significantly, because people, particularly if they've got a long commute, and you can work extremely well with the technology from home. I think it's actually improved people's lives. So I think the number of people within the CBDs on a regular basis will probably maybe be a little bit less, at least in the sort of the short to medium term. But as companies grow, I think we'll get those people back. But I think there is a bit of a trend towards people working in the suburbs, obviously from home, but also in space that's closer to their homes. We've seen co-working, the demand for co-working in our assets is significantly higher. The demand for suburban office space, from users who want to be closer to their employees in the suburbs has also increased substantially. So I think it has changed, but I think we're all trying to figure out what that actually means for the space, in our assets, but also in the CBD office assets.
Kelly, you've got, you're in the city big time. And if you look at, I don't know whether a lot of our visitors who are not close to our industry, but Broadway, which is a Mirvac shopping centre, has got the highest turnover per square metre of any centre in this country. It's one of the best in the world. What's your views on CBD?
Well, we probably wouldn't classify Broadway as CBD per se. It's out of trade area, so you're definitely being impacted to the point we've talked about regarding university students and travellers. The CBD, Met Centre and Greenwood, it is really, really difficult. And I'm aligned on the FY24. I don't think it's going to be 12 months. And I definitely agree with the sentiment of how do we get people back into the CBD. And I think you're going to see a shift on how people interact with the CBD. And we should start to see some changeover of what spaces are being used for. We've got the same experience, but CBD-wise, we're seeing people come wanting eventing spaces and using old shops for different purposes. But it's very, very difficult. And the public transport piece is enormous. People need to feel safe so that they can get back to work and interact with their friends and colleagues. And that's going to take some time.
Michelle, you're not in the CBD and you're not really big guns, but boy, have you got a lot of clients in convenience centres and so on. Do you see them changing, or do you think they'll be basically the same?
Oh no, I definitely see them changing. I think, it's quite interesting, this discussion about return to normal or the new normal. And frankly, I don't think there is going to be a new normal. I think the only constant is change, and the rapid pace of change has, just continued to accelerate, over recent years, and I think that's going to continue. I think it's kind of the new normal maybe is expect the unexpected, because who would imagine that would be sitting here, even 3 years ago, thinking about COVID and the implications of COVID. I mean, it's just remarkable. So yeah, I definitely see the convenience sector will continue to adapt and change, and we've heard some of these trends. This working from home, hybrid working, even the Great Migration. I think the stats are that there's something like more than 15% more movement to regional locations. Since the start of the pandemic, and all of these things are going to influence and change the neighbourhood shopping centre or the convenience shopping centre. But I think one thing that is going to remain, and that is that convenience is king. And I think this trend towards hyperlocal, for all the reasons we've already spoken about, is definitely going to continue. But there are a number of other trends that continued, I think, to influence as well. And that's there'll be the rise of services. I think we've talked about there's less consumerism, right? I'm proud to actually say this suit's over 10 years old that I'm wearing today, and it feels remarkable to actually get your recycled gear out of the closet that you haven't seen for the last 10 years. It's fantastic. So I think we are, jokes aside, we are consuming less. We're consuming less in terms of discretionary spend, on things like apparel. We're spending more on services. We're spending more on experiences. This hyper beauty. Personally, I hope this trend ends, because I'm not a fan of, shall we say, a lot of the enhancements. But anyway, nonetheless, it is what it is. It is a trend, and we're going to continue to see that. We're seeing IV therapies are coming through now. Fat cavitation. All of these kind of things that all are about enhancing how we look and feel about ourselves on Instagram. So I think there's a lot of change that's going to come through. Car park utilisation, we're going to see different ways that our car parks need to be utilised, because we're going to have autonomous driving vehicles, we're going to have nests for car parks, we're going to have the sharing economy is becoming more and more common. We'll have go-gets and car next doors, and all of these things will be in our shopping centres. So I think there's going to be tremendous change, and I think that's what's exciting. Personally, after being in this industry for 30 years like yourself, Michael, I was like, 30 years. Whew. That's what's exciting about it.
Did you join it when you were 5, did you?
I love you, Michael Lloyd.
Okay, that's changing the product. I'd like to move to the actual physical change of a product. We used to develop shopping centres not all that long ago, and that's what they were. They were a box, and then they changed from being a box onto partly open box, and then we changed them into, but they were still loads of retail. And now shopping centres, with mixed use and the whole bit, QIC, as much as anybody, has got that mixed use there. What are our centres going to be like in 5 to 10 years' time?
Yeah, I mean,
what are they? What's the entity going to be?
Yeah, I mean, we call our assets. I guess we're all moving away from the moniker of shopping centres, but we call our assets town centres, and that's really what they're becoming. I think, big strategic incredibly well located parcels of land in the centre of communities with fantastic transport infrastructure. I mean, it's not just, that land is not just appropriate for retail. And for so long, we made a lot of money out of adding additional retail, but these assets are so big now that they can offer, what the shopper and the consumer wants in a evolving way, and we're seeing that happening. But the opportunity to include complementary uses which also leverage off that location and that infrastructure, for us is like, it's so obvious.
Like what?
Well, office, suburban office, I mentioned. We see some terrific opportunities to integrate residential into these sites. We're looking at various build-to-rent opportunities where we want to control the actual real estate and the location. We've included hotels into a number of our assets. We see healthcare opportunities, civic spaces. So these become genuine sort of mixed-use town centres. And with a very strong retail core. I think that will continue, Michael. But and the reason that we can do that and we can actually generate really strong returns from those sort of incremental mixed-use developments is because the sites are so, they're so appropriate for those types of uses. And then what we're then thinking really hard about is how we integrate, say, the office component with the retail so that we can provide a really good experience for that office user. So, we're thinking about how we kind of lay down digital infrastructure so that, the amenity of the retail can work really well with the office space, with the hotels, and, there's a whole bunch of ways that we can kind of integrate those uses to get them all working, sort of symbiotically together. So that's how we, and we're sort of lucky because we have so much land around assets like Robina and Castle Towers and the Canberra Centre and Eastland and Water Gardens in Melbourne. And I guess that's the advantage of having these assets within wholesale funds where we could accumulate land over time without having that sort of constant kind of, reporting of earnings pressure, has meant that we've now got these extraordinary sites that we can implement these master plans.
Interesting. Peter, you're well versed on that kind of stuff, of adding things to shopping centres.
Yeah, I probably
Wanna
won't
add some?
repeat what Michael said because we were on a very similar strategy. The thing that I'll add to it, I mean, the advantage that we all have is essentially the valuation of our assets. Essentially, the land is already baked into the valuation. So in a strange way, at least for Ultima as a publicly listed company, the final owner of the company, the dividend holder, essentially gets the land for free. So when we're factoring in developments, retail is always going to be at the core. We're a retail business. The additional, then we look at all of our assets. We have 60 assets, 20 of them are fully master planned. There should be more. We're working through that. And then we have a highest and best use outcome with retail at the core. And as I said, with land, with the value of the economic value of the land already built in, we should essentially have, depending on where the asset is, anywhere from a 10 to 40% advantage of a private developer coming in trying to build a hotel or build a 9-storey office building in a regional centre. So for us, there's a couple of tricks though. If you're not building in CBDs, there's obviously a risk management situation, particularly in a situation with massively rising construction costs. Guys like ProBuild going down on the big end of the scale, which is where we play, is not overly helpful for competitive tension in the market. So for us, and then if you're not in a CBD and you're building a 9-storey office tower, you want to have some confidence around costing and you want to have some confidence around pre-leasing. So fundamentally, you have to be a lot further down the path in terms of approvals, which thankfully we are with design and with costing. And then you have to be in a position to really execute quickly. Because I think whilst everyone's doing this, I think the market is limited outside of CBDs for this type of competition in the short to medium term. And you have to be aggressively out there and taking a few risks to secure. Thankfully, we have done that. And we're expanding that, and we're fundamentally mixed use across the eastern seaboard.
And it's paying off?
Yeah.
How's the hotel doing
Terribly.
Yeah.
You know,
Today.
I shouldn't say it's a beautiful hotel. It's a 5-star hotel that we opened 3 months before a pandemic targeted at Chinese tourists. So fantastic. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like everyone in this room. We're not in this business to build for a short-term pandemic. You said it at the start, Michael. We're in our business. We're very long-term investors.
Yeah.
We're balance sheet investors. The hotel's targeted at a corporate office worker. It's that domestic traveller that's looking for special events, and obviously it's that tourism component. And the hotel's a classic scenario in Chadstone. Chadstone is the core. We will not disrupt that. The retail there is critical, but the hotel has to stand on its own right, and it will post-pandemic, and it has to have its own business case, but it has to be additive to the retail. And then to Michael's point, then we link it through technology. We link it through a tourism program. Then we're about to commence our 4th commercial office development there. We've just signed up Officeworks, which was a great outcome for us on 8,000 square metres, and we're about to build the next 20,000 square metre office there. So, what we learned from Chadstone, we're now looking to replicate across the rest of the portfolio.
Marco, when you take that out of the equation, the office blocks, the hotels, the commercial office towers, and you look at the inside of the centre, you've been quoted as saying that changing the tenant mix will also alter the body clock of a centre. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think obviously there's the mixed-use piece, and that will play to that body clock of the asset, because you've got residents and potentially office workers frequenting, the asset. But I think also from a mixed perspective, the idea, Michelle touched on it, I think you mentioned it, Michael, the idea that there's this service economy coming in. So if you look at categories like health and well-being, what does that mean for the asset? I mean, we just opened Karen up. We've got 3 gyms, and each of them cater to a different market. It's about customer preference. We've got a Good Life mass market. We've got a local operator, and then we've got one that's very much health and well-being, mind, body, and soul, and very boutique that has all the added services of a physio and chiro and meditation room, sound healing. In terms of the offer there, particularly with that Karen Up demographic. So I think the idea of repurposing particular space to go to where the customer is requiring those usages. So things like services, food. I mean, if you look at where we've come as an industry in 10 years, we had a food court, now we've got casual dining, we've got restaurant precincts, slow food, fast food, grazing throughout the asset as you walk your way around, and each of those have different operators in them. They're pitched at a different price point. They've got different size requirements because of the way they're working, and some of those trade really well in the morning. Some of those are part of that night economy that we talk about, and then you add in the idea of having residents on your doorstep. That plays to that body clock as well. And then again, repurposing again around core retail fashion. Our house views fashion, and the core pillars of a shopping centre still remain. They will probably downweight a little bit, and we've seen that as an industry. But then you are playing to potentially outside what was core retail. So medical, we've spoken about, health and well-being. Indooroopilly, we open in 2 weeks our auto mall there, which is a deal done with AP Eagers, 2,500 square metres. Car showroom, 10 different car brands, service centre above. Again, that's about, customer comes in at 6 o'clock and drop the car off, or 7, go down, get a cup of coffee, walk around the centre, not going to some sort of backwater industrial site trying to work out, how do I get back to the office? That's the sort of thinking, and I think that's the way, at least, we're thinking. I think my peers are thinking the same way, that, it's how do we repurpose some of these spaces and create that, and I think that will play to that extension of that body clock in the centre and drive towards the changing customer preference and that specialisation that customers are looking for.
Okay. I want to dwell on that for a bit, because I want to see what you people think is going to be the composition. And I'll give you a bit of an intro to it. We were talking earlier about MacArthur Square. MacArthur Square was the very first shopping centre, regional shopping centre that I leased. And we had a tenancy selection committee meeting. And used to go in with a tenant, a proposed tenant, put it on the table with the rent, everything else, and who he was. And the tenancy selection committee would either accept it or reject it. And I went in with a coffee shop. And MacArthur Square was a gun barrel mall. David Jones at one end and Woolworths supermarket at the other. And probably about 100 shops on each level, two-level centre. And I went in with a coffee shop. And I had a coffee shop for shop number 21 or whatever it was. And the chairman of the tenancy selection committee was an old guy called Colin Moore. And Colin Moore said, no, we can't have a coffee shop. We've already got one. And that's as true as I'm sitting here, that was the comment. And I said, yeah, but we can have two. I said, the other one's down the David Jones end, and we could put one up by the Woolworths end. And he said, no. He said, they'll both go broke. And I argued the point and got it. And after the meeting, he came to me and he said, Michael, do you realize that if that coffee shop goes broke, it's on your head? And I said, yes, Colin. Of course, it didn't go broke. But that was at a time where less than 1% of the total GLA of a shopping centre was food and beverage. That was before there was such thing as food courts. That was before there was such thing as restaurants in there. We had less than 1%. Today, it's over 40, knocking on the door of 50. What's your prognosis? And let's start with you, Michelle. Because even in your smaller centres, it's going to change.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you think is going to happen?
Do you think, am I talking about the large centres or am I talking about...
Anything.
Well, I did particularly like your idea of the 1950s style dance hall, actually. Anyone got any top levels of Maya that they might have available? Or David Jones? Anyway, I thought that was a good idea. Look, I think, absolutely, Marco touched on it in terms of, gyms and health and fitness is just one example. There are so many more boutique offerings that consumers are looking for, and our centres will continue to accommodate for those. I think health and fitness is a classic example. We've talked about beauty. So in our centres, we definitely see the discretionary usages continuing to downweight, in particular apparel. We only have 8% of our GLA with apparel today, and I see that reducing significantly over time. We certainly see health and services continuing to grow, and education, I think, is the other sort of slow burn. I think someone was telling me the other day that I think it's Cranbrook is taking a level of, I think it's Myer or David Jones or somewhere, it might even be Bondi, and I think we'll see more and more of that because that's actually a very cheap way for some of these education facilities to actually integrate into the communities, number one, but also, to be able to expand, without having the land available necessarily, in their own, within their own confines. So, there's some of the changes that I certainly see, and as I touched on also, I think car park utilisation is going to be huge, not just mixed use, but, various other things. Logistics, already, certainly we see our centres very much act as the last mile logistics, and not just for our supermarkets, but certainly 75% of our assets now have click and collect or drive-through, and we continue to work very closely with particularly the supermarkets in relation to that. And, Woolworths, I think their latest statistic is that around 90% of their click and collect shoppers actually go into the store. So that's a really interesting and very important because, some people think, are you detracting from your specialty retailers? And we don't think we are. We are about to do a piece of work on that to actually prove that proof point. But, logistics last mile, I think there's lots of changes around that are going to happen as well. You see Google Wing, I think you guys have got Google Wing already flying, KFC and Red Rooster or whoever else is, everything. Starbucks are around the place. So, there are lots and lots of ways I think that our assets are going to change. And as I said before, that is what is really exciting and dynamic about retail.
Kelly, you've got Mirvac's right out there with changing the mix of centres.
We are, and to your point before around, Susan led that path in making sure that our assets could be unique. And by exception, maybe I'll talk about, you think about your point around one coffee shop. 2 years ago, people weren't talking about the metaverse the way they are now. Yeah. And one of the things I think is hugely exciting and massive opportunity for us and our industry is how do we start to embrace all of the opportunities for omnichannel and broad channels for our retailers. The complexity for us, as we all know, and we've touched on it earlier, is buildings are built for 50 to 100-year structures, and more people want flexibility. Our operators want flexibility. They need to start to cater for supply chain issues, and that's the big challenge, but the big opportunity for our industry is to respond to that. And then also, how do you start to cater for, to Michelle's point, the small and interesting brands to get in? For us, we probably have a different lens somewhat to our peers. We've got the smaller scale to be able to do that in a little different way. We will really embrace the ability to structure contracts and flexibility and build things in a unique way for those smaller operators to get in. Because our customers are definitely speaking to the point that they want. You know, everyone loves the beautiful old restaurant that you've gone to for 30 years and you feel warm and you're known, but everyone also wants the brand new cocktail or the brand new restaurant. And use that as an example of how do you start to bring those operators into your centres to spice it up and then bring in the next fresh thing. So a big challenge. We're certainly doing a lot of work in that space and testing it in a pretty meaningful way already in the last 12 months. And then we move on to the next is how do we start to embrace all of the... fashion in particular is really interesting for me because they have gone, some of the bigger brands have gone really hard into metaverse and some of these new concepts. And it's an expensive exercise for embracing any new technology. And you've got to take the gamble sometimes. And I look at what I fund for my 19-year-old goddaughter in metaverse. Honestly, she's the best dressed kid on the street that she's bought a house in, which I think I probably paid for. But it's an extraordinary difference. And to Michelle's point around change, how do we start to adapt to that? I just don't think you can see 2 years ahead in all senses. And these very old and this old beautiful industry of ours, we have to start to respond from a construction and building perspective.
You bet. You mentioned omnichannel. I know you're big on omnichannel, Michael. I'd like you to address, instead of being academic and instead of being over the top and ethereal, how is omnichannel going to change our relationship with our retailers? And, you know, like it or not, it's always been us and them. It's always been us and them. I mean, they want lower rents, we want higher rents. There are times when we've partnered with them and so on and so forth, but I can see that we're going to really have to partner with them more in the future. What? Yeah,
I mean, I think the more we understand their business models and how they're evolving, their, you know, and all the good retailers are looking for multi-channel distribution, and that has no doubt that's accelerated through the pandemic. So I think understanding what they're trying to achieve, and what we're hearing, you know, really consistently is that they, you know, we're probably, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of it was about sort of just store footprint, you know, having as many stores to sort of defray costs, you know, even if stores weren't that profitable, it was kind of, they were helping the overall corporate. But now the discussion is much more targeted around where we think we can be the most productive. We want to be in the best centres. And in many cases we want more space in the best centres. The marginal centres we can kind of leave behind, and we can build an incredible profile around those physical sites, and then we can build off those a fantastic online distribution business. And, you know, particularly in a country the size of Australia, you know, what we've been seeing is that, you know, pure play retail is really hard to make work, or pure play online, because you have to be competitive in terms of pricing, and the cost of logistics just kills those businesses extremely difficult to be profitable on the volumes that they can achieve here. So that's where the omnichannel is now, I think, established as the prevalent retailing business model. And the more that we can provide them with the space requirements that they need in the most highly productive assets, that's where they want to be. And then we're having a dialogue with them about how can we assist them, particularly with click and collect, because at the end of the day, you know, they'd prefer not to have the logistics costs of delivery. So if they can encourage people into their stores, or at least into the retail asset, I mean, that's very helpful from a cost perspective. But it also gives them the opportunity to sell additional stock once they're in the store.
Michael, yeah, sorry, I think, you know, your point about, you know, we want the highest rents, they want the lowest rents, and there's probably, you know, there's some truth in that. The other part of that is...
No, there wasn't some truth. That's the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
That's true, but where we are joined at the hip is around the sales levels, and to Michael's point just then, it is about understanding their businesses, understanding what our customer within each trade area wants, and then right-sizing that offer, that box with that specialised type of retail that will work in that trade area. Because if we can get the productivity, you know, the old school of let's just add more retail and we're a destination in our own right is not the way we're thinking of it. That's where mixed use and these other usages where you're driving traffic and a different customer to that centre. But I think where it's important is getting the right size, getting the right retailer, getting those right usages, because it is about sales productivity. It is about driving the retailers' businesses to those higher levels of productivity. That then generates the higher rents for us. And I think that's the secret sauce. That's the element that I think is critical in the way we engage with retailers. It's about how do we help them deliver that sales productivity gain, you know, whether it's flagship stores, whether it is a closure around a particular centre that drives, you know, productivity to that store, or a bespoke offering within their business that will give us that outcome.
Peter, I want your view on this. You know, you in that Centre Group article that's in the current SEN. For example, you can go online now and you can buy something in a Westfield shopping centre that's 2,000 miles from where you live, and you can get it drawn and you get it delivered to your door and you can do all that. So that's changing the nature of that, and it's that real nature changing I'm looking for. Before I open for a couple of questions, give us your view on that.
No, Michael, it's clearly the way of the future. Well, I thought David Simon a few months ago came out with a really interesting report. It was completely biased for his view, but it was basically the shopping centres are the most sustainable distribution channel moving forward. Because if you look at what's happening in New York and other areas where you've got 1 million Uber trucks with busy containers running around town, and then the real conundrum is the returns. And so from the report basically said, to Michelle's comment, there's less consumerism. But on top of that is what is the most sustainable operating model moving forward? And we've all spoken about it here, which is essentially, from our role is really to understand by category, by trade area, exactly the total expenditure within that area, and then try and match that with our assets. And then to Marco's point, there's no point in just loading it up with retail. It has to be the right type of retail. And that's where that data sharing between ourselves and retailers come into play. And then on top of that, I do agree with Michael. What we're finding is the store sizes are getting larger, and in our key centres, and particularly for certain categories, and they're typically the categories in demand, and they're getting larger because the stores are doing a lot more than just selling product. They're acquiring customers, they're distributing straight from store. It's the last mile delivery, and similar to Elliot Lill and the Centre Group guys, it is how do you use your resources and your skills and your assets, and which part of the role do you want to play into that, where you can value add for yourself, but also value add for the retailer.
I think sometimes that competitive tension, Michael, between landlord, which I hate the language of, and retailer, I think we get lost in the fact that we're all aiming for one thing, which is to deliver the best consumer experience possible. And I think if we keep that lens, it starts to become less adversarial. And certainly, look, we have the luxury of a smaller portfolio, so you have to have those robust conversations around what are the possibilities for structuring things differently. I think that's our united ambition, is to be able to get to that point where if it is about customer, then everyone wins. Sometimes it doesn't need to be the way it is.
No, I agree, but I'm old school. I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Anyone got any? Or are we content to just let it flow?
Wait, Lawrence.
I know you were talking about the comeback to retail within the city CBDs. COVID's been one problem, but don't you find that there's a decentralisation of the main retail central core? For example, Lendlease at Barangaroo pulling a lot of the big office purchases away from retail, or in Melbourne where they've moved out to Docklands and the other areas. Don't you find the decentralisation of the city zone, it's going to be a problem going ahead?
Hey, Lawrence, how are you?
I don't know who that is.
There is probably some truth, absolutely, in that. Barangaroo, I think, did stretch the city core. To a certain degree, it depends on the retail that's actually in the precincts. So I think Mark has said this before. For us, that retail is that's in our CBD centres. It's really designed for that special purpose shop. It's Australian designer fashion. There's some luxury. There's some gifting, and that's very different than what's in Barangaroo. But in terms of competition for food and beverage and entertainment, absolutely, there's a bit of a stretch. With all due respect to peers in Melbourne, I don't think Dockland really has that same impact at this point in time, because fundamentally, I don't think it has the same, polite way of saying this, the heart and soul around that placemaking that Barangaroo's actually done very well. That isn't done in Dockland, so it hasn't had the same impact of really deferring that consumer spend down there.
Anyone like to add to that? Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Lisa Bella Esposito. I'm a town planner and the owner of Milestone Town Planning. I wanted to ask the panel where they thought, their thoughts on the barriers in the New South Wales planning framework in to be able to deliver and respond and pivot to the change in the response times that are required.
Geez, how long have we got?
Do you want to kick it off?
No, I'm staying out of that one.
I'll kick it off. Look, I think like most industries, part of the problem with we've been dealing a lot at state level through the pandemic because even at the city level or council level, it's even more problematic. Everyone's fighting for resources, whether it's retail or whether it's government. And what we find is they're very complicated applications that come through. The stuff that we do is very large. Our top 6 developments, they're all over $500 million to multiple $1 billion. And the scale of those is really, a development authority should actually be put together, the old development authorities, to deal with those. And there's some mechanisms, obviously, within New South Wales to deal with it, but you're still essentially going through a council process first before you get elevated up. So I still think there's far too many red tapes, far too many hurdles, and they lack resources, and there's no time limit that's set. So you do miss opportunities as a result. It's not by a lack of wanting to get to the right outcome. It's really by too many hurdles and a lack of capacity inside planning to actually get to the outcome at the right point in time, would be my view.
I think what we find though is that, and I'm sure the other panellists would agree with this, that if you're bringing the council officers along on the journey on your master plan, and they completely understand what you're trying to do, and they can see the benefits of that to the community, it's very rare that we have problems with the actual development application process. On some of those really bigger projects, Pete, that are of state significance, that's probably where, you kind of have a bit more red tape and issues around timing and bringing those things to fruition. But at the council level, we find it a very easy process generally.
Lisa, I've got a bit of a theory on that. And in closing, because we're not at the end of it, I'd like you to comment on that. If you look at our shopping centres and what they are and what they used to be, if you look at the customer focus now that all you guys have talked to me about since years, that continuing customer focus, and now you're building up incredible amounts of data on your customers. Quite frankly, you're becoming quite powerful. And you could decide to harness that power. I mean, the old days when the local aspirant for the local seat would ask you, can I come in the shopping centre and shake hands with a few people, and kiss a few babies, and that's it, and pat a few dogs. I mean, we're beyond that now. You know who lives in that shopping centre, in that 250,000, 300,000 people. You know what they spend their money on. You know what they work at. You know what they're social. You know a lot about them. And you could get powerful. I'd like you to comment on that. Do you see your role moving beyond property development and getting into perhaps, movement of social structures? Do you ever see that in the future?
Well, I think we've joined the metaverse, as Kelly said. And so, the way that the data that we have on our shoppers, you're right, Michael, is, it's light years from what we used to have. And I think, we're still trying to figure out how we best leverage that and use it. But clearly the opportunity is, through our digital infrastructure, is to have a much more personal relationship with our customer base than we've ever had. And so, we're working through how do we tailor that offering in a way that really works for the customer and actually create some value for them, rather than just getting, we all get stuff pinged to our phones and we hate it. So, kind of getting something that's actually valuable is quite challenging, I think. But it's a weapon. Not in a bad way, but it's a really positive weapon potentially, I think.
Yeah. Look, we agree with that. And I think there's two key areas for us is how do you equip all of your partners, your business partners, the retailers, with that information so they can use it to their advantage, because I think that's the power, is our collective outcome is where the success is going to be. And then I think there's a secondary piece around how do you be a force for good? How do you do the right thing? How do you use all that information to make a difference to the social dynamic within your communities? The fact is it's beyond sustainability now. You have to think much further ahead in what social impacts you can have to change the planet and to make our children's lives much better. So I think those two areas for us is where that opportunity for that information or data stems to feed better outcomes.
Great. Any other comments on that?
I think, certainly data for us, there is so much data. I think that's kind of what we're saying. And I do think that in general, we're kind of grappling with what do we do with this data. The most obvious is about, how do we ensure that we have the right things that our customers, and certainly in our centres, are looking for everyday essentials. We want them coming every day, we want them coming in and out. And it's also, to Kelly's point, it is for us about, building thriving communities. And so how do we play a role, and how can data maybe play a role in how we can actually help build these thriving communities and ensure that these communities continue to thrive?
I'll take a slightly different slant. I think if you look at sustainability and data, so technology that we've introduced in the portfolio, AI technology that captures data and controls the BMS system. We no longer have centres that are turning on their chillers at 6:30 in the morning and just running them. This technology is actually being able to control light and power usage and those sorts of things. So I think it's important that we sort of look at that data in creating better decisions or better outcomes in terms of environmental, or whether decisions around the core retail and the placemaking and the vibrancy of our assets. And also, you know, going forward, I think it will help with some of those social type activities, particularly when we talk community interaction and personalising types of messages to certain groups. I think that data is very important, but we use it for the right reasons. And I think, you know, it's about capturing that as a landlord and then utilising that as part of our operating system.
Yeah, I agree 100%, but that's the nice stuff. The other stuff is you've got a lot of power in that data, a lot of power. I mean, you know, Facebook, for example, it's got a lot of power, and it uses it. I mean, you're shopping centre owners, and you've got that data. Is your role going to change dramatically because you've got that data and you're guardians of it? I mean, it's powerful stuff. Yeah. Any others? We are an hour into it, so we're coming to a close. I've got to thank the panel, and it's a great panel. This was live streamed. It went to right across Australia and New Zealand. It also went to Canada. It went to Dubai. It went to United Arab Emirates.
Oh, fantastic.
Went to England. And it's got quite a lot of interest because of the expertise that's in Australia. Undoubtedly the number one in the world in terms of shopping centre development and management. So thanks to the panel. Thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate that, and I'm very grateful to you coming, and give them a big hand. You're done.